to be successful, you need to bring all of those teams together and say, right, these are the 10 things we're going to do. Let's kick this around. Let's all understand what we all do within that space and what we're all accountable for, putting the customer at the center.
Welcome to today's edition of Trust Builders. We've got a really fantastic lineup today. We're joined with Caroline. Caroline is our guest speaker for today, and you'll see this loading live in LinkedIn. So today's Trust Builders is really focused on this idea of defining new value in customer experience. Caroline Winwood is a transformational leader with 3 decades of experience working with, I know, Caroline, I'm making you blush here, 3 decades of experience with what would be described as some of the most preeminent brands in the world, Dyson and Pepsi. And what I really enjoyed in our catch-up, Caroline, is that career has spanned from physical products to digital products. You've been looking at employee experience, customer experience. You've done it all, right? Which is really phenomenal. And also the wonderful Alex Genov. Alex, it's early for you. You're in Las Vegas. We're in the UK. So thank you so much for getting up early. You're looking as great as always. I'm digging the gold Ted Baker blazer, no doubt. Yes, looking good. So I think, Caroline, it might be useful to just quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll get started in today's discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris and Alex, for having me. Yeah, I'm also loving the gold blazer, Alex, looking very festive. So yeah, thanks guys for having me. I tried to introduce myself. I like to sort of summarize my career as I sort of talk about I've had a career with the customer. And my big sort of epiphany, if you like, as I look back on my career, is that all businesses are there to drive value from their customers. And those customers come in all different shapes and sizes, and how you unlock that value and that value exchange varies, whether or not you're B2B, B2C, D2C. It does vary, but that ultimate core principle of being there to unlock that value is the same. It doesn't matter what you do.
And I suppose, Caroline, you've had global leadership positions, but take us back to that moment when I know you're driving through the countryside in England in your early career, visiting your first customer, where that, I suppose, realization took place of that value exchange.
So Alex, Chris and I were talking about this yesterday. We were talking about first jobs. And one of my first jobs was I worked for Walker's Crisps, which in the US is Frito-Lay, it's owned by PepsiCo. And I was a regional sales rep. And I suspect lots of people listening did similar jobs as well. All the big brands in the UK ran these jobs. Mars, Heinz, Coke, Walker's were not unusual in this place. And my job was to drive sales through the regional cash and carries wholesale by building relationships with the local corner shops. That was my job. That was how I was going to drive value. And the local corner shops were my customer. But obviously they had customers as well. So their job was to drive value from their customers. And I did this in the northeast of England, which is where I'm from. So I was driving around the streets of Newcastle and Gateshead in what felt like at the time an enormous Peugeot 406 estate, which I couldn't reverse for love nor money, with all my boxes of crisps in the back. And when I look back on that period of time now, I think we all work in big businesses that are multifaceted, and some days they can feel very, very complex. But actually, what I learned then and the simplicity of it, actually, I think really applies to big business today. So for me to be successful in my role, I needed to understand my customer's business. Now, very rarely did I walk into a corner shop and say, so tell me about your business. And they tell me about their turnover and their profit and return and things like this. It just never happened. But I learned somebody really bright taught me how to walk the store, look at the sell-by dates in the store, look at what other brands they were selling, ask what kind of questions. You didn't ask them what they sold. You asked them how many times a week did they go to the cash and carry. And that gave you an idea of what their business was like. You also learn quite quickly to fathom out, well, what's important to them? Are you 2 years away from retirement and you're just looking to tick over and have an easy life? In which case, I can make your life really easy. I'm young and keen. I'm going to fill those shelves for you and do it out my car. Or are you looking to open 5 new stores in 2 years? So you need a merchandising plan. You need somebody to come and train your staff how to do it. And so that personalization and that understanding allowed me to drive value from my customers, age 22 as I was at the time. And that sort of real basic principle of understanding personalization and unlocking the how are you going to do it, I think is what applies to so many business today as they try and get value from their customers.
I love that idea, Caroline, and certainly a real passion topic for Alex. And your notion of that human-to-human personalization rather than today where personalization can go astray. And one for Alex. Alex, I haven't asked you what your first job was and whether that aligns to Caroline's perspective on retail. So I'd love to kind of bring you in there.
Yeah, no, Chris, it's been for me too. It's hard to think back on all those years, but I would say I was in college here and my first job was a projectionist in Cornell Cinema, which at that time I had no idea about customer centricity and I was just trying to change the reel so that we didn't run out in the middle. So it's a little bit different, but I really, Caroline, love this story because I think it brings home this point of imagine if decisions had to be made by just looking at spreadsheets, right? Because let's say somewhere or centrally they have spreadsheets to represent those stores, right? And these rows and columns, and then you make decisions from that. So imagine that experience versus you in there in person, looking, talking, right? So that to me is the biggest, because nowadays I think a lot of with more and more data easily accessible, easily stored. Nowadays the sentiment is, well, we first of all it's not scalable. We can't send 10,000 Carolines to those stores. And secondly, here's the data, here's the rows and here's the columns and the numbers, the cells.
So I think that's a wonderful segue into fast forward all those well-won experiences in Dyson and PepsiCo. We suddenly come to this point that there's 5 key reflections, Caroline, in terms of defining why we need to think about creating a new value and customer experience, and then how do you actually go about that. So maybe if you're to introduce the first principle, and then we'll kind of expand that as we go.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know me, I have this mantra that sort of customer experience transformation it's my speciality. And so I almost think about everything like a transformation now, even if it's just a day job. And that's really because I believe companies have got to continue to evolve or transform, and businesses that don't do that ultimately fail, as I know both of you know. I always say, and Alex, this actually really plays to the point you just made about data. I think any transformation should start with the outputs. And that's a cold place to start, actually, because ultimately the outputs for most businesses is P&L. It's what are you trying to achieve? And ultimately that's generally profit, might be turnover, but ultimately it's profit. And it's the job of your C-suite and your transformational leadership to understand if your CEO is saying, right, we're going to take the business from A to B, and B being the ultimate commercial output. It's the job of your C-suite and your transformational leadership to say, right, how are we going to do that? What do we need to create, unlock, build in order to take us there? And by focusing on that and actually starting really within that C-suite and being aligned on what B looks like and having that real clear alignment, then gives you that internal license sponsorship to start engaging lower down the teams throughout the organization and start that creative magic, which is really what is the exciting part. Ultimately, the number on the spreadsheet is a sign of success, but the real magic happens once you get people together behind trying to chase that number. And you start to unlock the how and talk about what people can do and build together. but it's got to cut. But if you're not aligned on what that is, what you're trying to achieve in the first place, then that can be really messy and very difficult. And you don't build the trust in the organization that's needed to be successful.
I think what is really interesting, what Caroline's saying, Alex, is this idea of manifesto for change and the real need for change within customer experience. And it's, I think it's an unexplored topic. Customer experience tends to think in these, we're in the customer experience department. So I think Caroline's opening our viewpoint into this idea that change is constant. It's actually required within customer experience. How do you actually go about that? And I think by framing the outputs on desired business goals and then aligning the customer experience to reimagine that is really critical. So love to hear your perspective. And then there's almost an unfolding of how we go from an output to actually delivering that. So that's where we're navigating towards, Alex, as we go through the various principles.
Love it, Chris. So yeah, Carol, I really love your point of view of this value exchange, essentially, because there's two parties there. Right. And I think this it's absolutely clear when it's the business has to run. If the business doesn't generate profit, the business is going to go away. That's clear. But I think it's just like you said, how you phrase things and how you frame the call to action. One thing is to say, gather the employees and say, let's generate 10% more profit this year. And that's different than saying, okay, let's do this for customers. You generate 10% profit, right? Because it's the first will excite the shareholders and excite the financial analysts and the Wall Street, right? Behind the scenes, they're like, But then for the employees and for everybody else, I think you phrase it a little bit differently. And I'm sure you've seen this in your career.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I couldn't agree more, actually. And that's, in particular, I really like the word value because it holds those multifaceted meanings. I mean, yes, it means cold, hard, dollars, pounds, monetary value, but it also speaks to the emotional value. And I think for both customers and employees today, both are equally important. And in fact, if you're in a country with a real active job market, and I know a lot of us aren't at the moment, but if you are in a country with a real job market, actually those emotional connections are so, so deeply important.
I would love to hold that thought because actually, when you think about Dyson and the difference between Dyson and PepsiCo, right? One could be selling a commodity, but reimagining what that commodity can deliver from a value perspective. And often that's driven by an emotional connection to the product. So it's like, how do you build that value and reimagining the experience by building in that emotional connection to the brand?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't think it really matters what you're selling. I don't think it does. And again, I mean, obviously I've spent a lot of time in consumer goods. So when I first think about emotional connection, I'm probably thinking much more about the consumer. But I generally think of this as a triangle. Really interested to know what Alex takes on this. But I sort of think about, you've got your product, and that could be a service, but ultimately you've got the product, wherever it could be chocolate bars, crisps, hairdryers. You have a product, you have your customer experience, and you've got your brand. And I think the three things sit within a triangle. I know, Chris, you and I were talking yesterday, we were talking about electricity.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it doesn't matter what electricity supplier I've got, my lights work exactly the same. There's nothing different really in the product. But the brand and the experience are really what inform a lot of that value exchange. There is price in there, obviously, and it's a very cost-conscious market. But if you look at guys really growing at pace today, if you look at the octopuses and the other people in that sustainable place, they're building a reputation on sustainability, their values, but also very much on that customer experience, putting that at their core. And the product actually has not that much to do with it because my lights work exactly the same.
I completely agree. I think it's a great point. And I do see a difference in the stage of innovation and where you are as a company and as a product. I mean, when you're essentially with those snacks, right, you're selling sugar and fat and salt that hit the brain a certain way. right? And that triggers, I mean, it is an emotional connection. People develop cravings and so on, right? So that's what you're selling. So you cannot be saying we have the best sugar, we have the best salt and crap, So then you have to build this, then you sell it through humor and other things and develop as a company and so on. But when they developed the iPhone, this was a completely different, this didn't exist. This computer that could do all these things. So I see this difference between product centricity and customer centricity. And I've learned this from Professor Peter Fader, that any company can be successful this way or that way. Nowadays, it's much more difficult to be product centric and win through this product superiority and operational excellence. So I think I completely believe in the triangle. There's just different dynamics and different weights at different times, possibly. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I think sort of going back to that concept of transformation, there are so many well-established organizations, brands today who perhaps have just one or two of the segments sorted out, and actually they're on a journey to get all three into balance in order to be successful. And the global economy, I think, has a massive impact on this as well, that the speed at which products can now be developed and come to market, particularly in consumer tech, but in fashion as well, it is just incredible. So it's no longer enough to be the best phone. You have to have all aspects in place and be great today, but also as an organization, knowing where you're going to be great tomorrow.
And I think that nicely allows us to summarize the first principle being focus on the output. But I think where we've reached a really nice place is where that journey to the output is aligned between the customers and the business impact, and blending those two things. And by emphasizing one, you actually trade off the other, and growth relies on both. So Caroline, now we've aligned on what the output is. Take it through to kind of having that agreed. Where do we go next in terms of?
So I passionately believe that experience is by design. Nothing happens really by accident. In order to create that transformation and bring all aspects of your triangle together, you need to really understand, right? If we just focus on customer experience for a minute, what are the experiences we're trying to create? What are they today? And most importantly for me, with my operational hat on, is who is involved. And one of the big things learning to me in my career is that quite often the only people who have design in their job title are the UX designers on the website or the product designers. But actually, when you take apart those customer experiences, yes, what I've just talked about is deeply important, but so are the guys in the warehouse, the guys forecasting the stock, the people in accounts payable who make the money flow to and from your customers, stability, customer services. There's this whole plethora of below the obvious line of operational teams that make that customer experience win. And they're probably not aware of it. And this is where quite often experiences fail. In my experience, is to be successful, you need to bring all of those teams together and say, right, these are the 10 things we're going to do. Let's kick this around. Let's all understand what we all do within that space and what we're all accountable for, putting the customer at the center.
I think this is a big point for you, Alex, right, to come in, because I know we have this discussion around, can you actually design? An experience happens versus an experience being designed. But I think the reframe for me is actually, how do you design the value? What are the constituent parts that actually make up the value? And that's a big reframe for me. And I think it's an overlooked aspect. Where does the contribution to creating the value? And that's actually when you bring that together, you get towards this idea of customer centricity. So I'd love to kind of just orientate you towards that way, Alex, as you frame your question to Caroline.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think it's brilliant how, Caroline, you put it. In a way, you're talking about orchestration, and I think that's an orchestrate is a good metaphor for that, because everything has to work just so that the audience has an experience, right? And And if it works perfectly, the audience is going to cry, be emotional. If the trombone is off, they're going to laugh. Right. So they're going to have different experiences. And Chris alludes to the fact that as a psychologist, strictly speaking, you cannot design how somebody feels, right? Because you can design a product, a service, and if you know your customer well enough and you have this match, the experience will happen. But I agree with you, and I really love what you're saying, like really dissecting these terms now that have become overused, like design, like, and say, I designed this and I designed that. Whereas they mean just an interface, right, nowadays, or what is an experience. I think we need to keep constantly asking ourselves, what do these really mean?
Yeah, very much so. The word I like to put in there is operational design, that of which the visual is really important. But actually, if your operational design, your orchestra isn't all playing from the same music in time, then, like I said, it jars, it's deeply uncomfortable, and nobody wants to engage with that.
Exactly. And for example, Amazon is a case in point that they went through operational excellence in Peter Fader's. I mean, they say they're customer obsessed, which is the result. The great customer value is unlocked, but the way they do it is through the operations.
And I think the point that Caroline would make is this needs to be co-created, right? So if you push it down rather than bring it together, then that makes for a more effective operational design. Caroline, what are some of the practical ways that you could start that conversation? Now that you've defined the output, you need to think about that operational design. What are the ways that you've seen that work really effectively?
So, I mean, this sounds really crude, but quite literally getting people in the same room or on the same call and doing this digitally, but literally standing, and you can have, in a complex retail organization, you could have 20 people in this room, but literally standing there and explaining what everybody does and saying, okay, let's take an experience, let's take payments to refund or something like that. And just literally mapping it out on a board and giving everybody in the room the opportunity to say, I do this, I do that. I do that once a week. Well, what does that mean if your accounts payable only runs once a week when you've actually got 7 trucks arriving in a warehouse a day and things of that nature? This isn't just my experiences speaking to colleagues around consumer goods. It can be incredibly powerful. Suddenly, not only does everybody learn something and everybody goes, oh, so that's why that fails. It's because that only happens there. Suddenly you've all got this deeper appreciation for each other and they will let you play, and everybody becomes so much more outward looking. And you're absolutely right, Alex, that you can't design how people are going to feel, but I think it's also well documented, hopefully you'd agree, that when people look externally and more outward looking rather than inward looking, that's a happier person and probably a healthier organization as well. I take it a little step further though, and one of the great empowering things that I think can come out of those type of workshops are actually setting some principles for the change. So let's say if you're looking at something like a payment to refund, let's keep with that, saying, okay, at the moment it takes 10 days and we only speak to our customer twice, right? We want this to take 5 days and we need to have 5 points of communication. You can then empower the teams to go away and say, okay, let's have a 2B, let's look at that and work within these parameters. And it really gives everybody a framework to work within. And if they come back and say, oh, we can only do it in 5.2 days unless we do X, Y, and Z, suddenly the conversations start to flow and the creativity flows. And you know what, you might end up doing it in 3.
I think a very small point, but really important. This only happens without the kind of leadership buy-in. And I think for CX audience here, there's an opportunity to elevate the function of CX as an orchestrator, but also allowing to empower those. I really like the idea of principles because that turns the output that you start to an outcome. And then the magic happens. People start to do small acts of courtesy for the customer. They think about how they contribute. Alex, you've seen where those outcomes are set in Zappos, where you get people catching up with their customers as if they're old friends and ordering them pizza and doing all sorts. How do you engender that in a cultural setting for employees?
Yeah, great question, Chris. I mean, I think it is those rituals. It is those leader you intentionally design that process. And Carol, I completely agree with you. It's hard to do this online with a group of people, and I've seen the power of people getting together and physically drawing, physically being there and mapping things out, because that's how our brains work. We also, and then going back to that analogy of an orchestra, imagine if the director practices separately with each instrument, and then you bring them together and you hope that it's gonna work, right? So I think that's the point, and that also kind of brings this necessity of having people physically in the same place, which now there's a lot of back to the office. But I think if leaders were more specific about that, to say, we need you to do this together because it's hard to do it outside of the office, right? Instead, they say, we need you all 3 days a week in the office, in your seats. It's very different than if they say, this is why we need you here.
I love that idea of coming together for purpose, and obviously principle, using that as a core kind of compass for the discussion, which is amazing. I know there's so much to unpack here, right? So we've got to the outputs. We've now thought about bringing people together. You've now got the principles. Caroline, how do you then move from the principles to step number 3?
So I think there's a little sort of sidestep within this, which we could call a step, which is all about time and success factors, which sort of brings us on to data, which I think is the next point. We absolutely have to talk about data within this mix. But I've given a couple of examples of 2 very specific customer journeys. But generally, if you're looking to drive a transformation, you're looking to impact the triangle, your product, your customer experience, and your brand triangle. There's lots of things within that space you're trying to change. And often these transformations can feel too big, too and get lost within that, particularly if they take multiple financial years or there's change in leadership and that type of thing. So I think it's really important at this stage, as you bring people together, to signpost the stages of the transformation. Understand what are the big wins and what are the quick wins, and they might not be the same thing, but to map that out as quickly as you can as part of that journey. So deploying a whole new CRM, customer experience platform across multiple countries, that can take quite some time. I'm sure there's some tech guys on the phone, and I'm sure I can do it on the call listening. But we can do it quite quickly. It takes time to do it properly, and so it should. It's a big thing. It's a big investment. But there's some things you can do very quickly. So in terms of tone of voice, training, things you can do in social media, you can scale up teams relatively quickly to drive content, to change your narrative as a brand on social media. Chatting with some colleagues this week, how suddenly we're all being bombarded with Black Friday and Christmas deals, and it's all price. And these are companies, I mean, I'm not seeing the data, but these are companies I've not heard of for the last 12 months, probably since last Christmas. So I'm not really feeling any emotional connection, whereas they could have used 12 months of social media stories to make me buy into them and a brand, and I'm probably then much more likely to jump. And it's easy to say and hard to do. And like I said, I'm not looking at the data, but there are things like that you can trickle with throughout your transformational roadmap. Show those quick wins, show the impact, and make everybody feel good about it, about the contribution that they're making. So celebrate, create a timeline, celebrate the outward inputs, but also celebrate your internal inputs. So when you have those eureka moments that go, crikey, we've identified 10 reasons why our experiences fail today, we can see this and we can quantify it, celebrate that, because that's got such great value potentially for your customers once you act on it. And I think that's really important.
It's a really great point that you made, Caroline, because I think, and we're seeing this shift in CX. Where does it sit? Does it sit in marketing, or is it a standalone department as well? But I think as you talk about change, there's obviously hard problems and soft problems, and often marketing can tackle some of those communication, forward-looking proposition statements, and that can really define the tone for the change and really accelerate the change as well. And we're seeing that, whether you like it or not, with Jaguar at the moment. They did their teaser concept with their advert, obviously repositioning as an electric only motive manufacturer, and then coming out with a concept car, and then it'll be that change may happen in a couple of years' time when the car becomes available. So maybe it's not a good example, but I do think that announcing the change and bringing the people along with that change message can be done really effectively from marketing. If you're then to think about getting us to the last mile here with stage 4 and 5, how do you complete the circle?
I will actually sort of just bring in a mistake that I've made along the way, Alex. So this is definitely a mistake I made. We got so far down a redesign involving digital and CRM, and then we started to talk about, this is several years ago, we started to talk about the reporting. Well, I want to see this report and that report, and I want to know who's responding and how quickly we're answering and how quickly we're resolving. And suddenly we realized that whereas we had a reporting suite, we purchased it, we hadn't actually designed the data flows to enable that reporting to work. So actually what I've written down here in big capital letters on my notes is data at every stage, and I've underlined it 3 times. And I don't think anybody would make those mistakes today, given how data conscious we all are and how data rich our environments are. But I do think it's important to, within that richness, to understand what data is informing the decisions you're making today and how you're going to measure how that data is going to change as you make the change. Because as you change experiences, your metrics change. And so understanding your befores and the afters becomes really can be quite difficult, and therefore measuring success perhaps might not be as black and white as you intended. But also making sure you, by design, going back to that concept of design, that you design those data flows and the repositories alongside your experience, and really think hard about the story and the insights you want to gather from that data. And I think that's really key. Somebody asked me, actually, I was in a conversation with somebody else earlier in the week, and they asked me about, so what would I talk about the difference between input data and output data? And with my customer service hat on, people get quite obsessed about, well, how quickly do we answer the phones, reply to an email? And they're really important. They are very, very important. But what they don't tell you is how quickly did we solve the problem? And did we actually solve the problem? And why did the problem happen in the first place? So actually for me, those 2 outputs would be customer resolution and failure. Why was the customer having to contact us in the first place? What actually failed? And so really thinking about those stories and then how you feed that back into the organization to drive deeper satisfaction, which obviously, Chris, is your world, is really critical, I think, as part of your design.
Well, that's fantastic. I have a question that kind of allows a nice segue. Ella asked, can you talk about the difference between continuous improvement and transformation? So maybe that's a nice segue into the next stage as well.
Yeah. Alex, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it?
Oh, you are... Yes.
Okay. I think it was a really, really good question. Was it Ella? Did you say, Chris?
Yes, Ella,
Yeah.
and it was actually my production team wrote it. I feel from
Loving how slick that. It's a really good question, and I think transformation is about where do you go next as an organization, and it's about what are you going to build, unlock, drive, and if you sort of going back to those 3 things in our triangle, your product proposition, your CX, and your brand. What are you looking to change within those? And it's strategic all the way down to operational. Whereas your continuous improvement, in my head, it's what a good operation should do every day within the parameters and the designs that you've created. And one, actually, that they do have a symbiotic relationship because one ultimately feeds the other. So if your process improvement team are constantly telling you, actually, guys, we've made 20 tweaks, improvements, enhancements, and we don't think we can take it any further, but our customers are still not engaged in how we want them to be engaged. We're not getting the value that we need to take us to point B on that chart. If we go back to right when we started talking about the vision, that's when you then say, okay, now we start again and we go into transformation.
Superb. And I think what kind of unifies the point and linking it back then is this commitment to innovation, which then engenders change as well. And I think that's something that Dyson have really led the way in terms of their leadership and commitment to innovation. They've had breakthrough products. Who knew you could move a normal hairdryer to the sonic hairdryer that was able to give you a better look and all these other innovations in terms of the hairdryer, taking these simple everyday tasks and transforming it into an experience. So I think that commitment to innovation, I hope in part you'd agree with, Caroline, as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the products are absolutely incredible, and the innovation in that space is amazing. And I think that Dyson is not alone in its ethos as a company. We've already talked about Jaguar looking to be really disruptive and think differently. We've mentioned Apple looking to think differently. I think there's a whole plethora actually of customers of companies out there who understands that innovation design, innovation experience is what's going to give them that cutting edge. And it, again, is not just something that needs to happen in consumer goods space. I think it happens across services, B2B. I've had, in the last 6 months, I've looked at some incredible innovative companies in the building space and the things that they're doing to drive efficiency in off-site production and things like it. It's absolutely groundbreaking and incredible and quite often hidden. What makes the likes of a Dyson and an Apple more front of mind is that they are out there in the consumer space, and so they're more visible. And actually, there's equally as much design and innovation going on behind the scenes, making a big difference to lots of people's lives in sciences and healthcare and the likes as well.
Super. We're actually now in our last 5 minutes of the segment of today's Trust Builders. I suppose, Caroline, in terms of your reflections of thinking about the output, then transform that, the outcome through principles that really empower people to go forward and to be able to think about change. And we've talked about your third stage, which is really about allowing data to inform some of those decisions, those insights that really help steer the ship, provide moments for celebration as well. I suppose just to think through those two remaining steps, we talked about governance and how you bring people together to ensure that the change is sustained, but also I think you're also going to touch on employee experience and the importance of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the two very much go together. And I think in my early stages when starting to manage transformation programs, the governance part of it was almost like something separate. You did your job, you did the transformation, and then you got ready for all the governance meetings and your program boards, etc. And through experience, what I realized actually is that for the governance to be really good and impactful and add value to transformation, you need to make it part of the experience and you need to take the teams in with you. I love the name of this podcast. Trust for me is everything. And I think that within that governance actually is where you can create real trust between the organization and its leadership and have those real authentic conversations about, hey, we're on this roadmap. We've done all of these great things. This is what we're struggling with, or we can't do, or we can do, but we can only do if we do this. And it's only by really facing into that and everybody coming to the table with their creative hats on that you get through and you clarify what it is you want to do. But secondly, by bringing teams into that space, you make them feel part of the experience. And you make that part of your communication as well. So whether or not you're changing things for 5 employees, 10 employees, or 10,000 employees, it can be daunting, it can be frightening. It can feel as though it's something that's being done to you rather than something that you're building and contributing to yourself. And so by bringing people in and showing them this is what we're building and we're doing, and thanking them, but also saying, we've hit a few snags and this is how we've worked through it, and thank you for your contribution there. It can be so much more valuable than a newsletter telling them that what day they've got to go to training and really sort of dry things, just telling them. Alex, you talked a little bit about this at the beginning, I think, about how you manage that and the communication that goes with it. And that in itself takes time. And so for me, one of the most important people on your transformation team is actually your communications lead, who's going to help you craft and tell those stories through the organizations and possibly externally as well, but certainly through the organization, you should drive that.
No, Caroline, I really love this whole perspective of bringing people along. And what you said, I think it's something is absolutely fundamental and brilliant. It reminds me of this idea of hospitality. And why am I saying that? I'm a big fan of Danny Meyer, who's a New York restaurateur who wrote the book Setting the Table. And he defines hospitality as when something happens for you, not to you. So I think when he said this feels like it happened to you, right? Then organizations obviously have a choice to make it feel like it happens for you. Superficially, not through just like spin, but for real, and understanding your employees as you understand your customers. And I think this total experience is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And it was when you mentioned the word governance, when we first discussed that, Caroline, I was like, that sounds very bureaucratic. And actually what I relearned from our discussion was that actually it's a part of the mechanism for actually making the whole customer experience work, and actually connect your first step to the last step, which is leadership buy-in, sustainability of the change, and as you say, being able to go over these speed bumps that inevitably happen in any change, and ensuring that you have the ability to bring people together, which is a really good final reflection. So, Caroline, all I have to do is to thank you so much for taking part in today's Trust Builder session. Really fantastic to start the journey by, whilst you've had this wonderful global career in Dyson, some of those early moments in your career have really stayed through into your leadership roles. We then took our listeners through 5 key principles of how they could really enact change within their organizations. And I think you provided a really practical key pointers for people to really take on board. So I really appreciate your contribution today. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes, superb.
Nice to meet you, Alex.
Thank you, Caroline. Fantastic points and really great lessons.
Thank you so much. And for everyone, I'm going to try and maybe squeeze in a final session before Christmas, but I suppose an opportunity to wish Caroline a happy Christmas and New Year as well. So thanks so much. And we'll be continuing the conversation in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you, Don.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye-bye.